Listen-only mode.
So good day everybody, welcome to our webinar on the DocuWare Workflow Manager. Today I'm assisted by Gary, Juan and Robin, and they will try and answer any questions that you may pose during the course of the webinar, and I'll review the questions during our quick Q&A session at the end, so hopefully if there's anything that requires answering we can do that. So today we're going to look at the components of the workflow, substitution rules, available activities in a workflow, the creation of a workflow instance. I'm going to give you a live demonstration of creating and running a workflow. We'll discuss the new database and the debugging tools available. So, the workflow consists of three components. We have our workflow engine, and this is our designer, which runs on the Windows desktop. We have, that's the actual engine in the system. Our workflow designer, which runs on the desktop, and our workflow task lists. So the engine handles the workflow and the workflow instances. The documents in a workflow are stored in a file cabinet. That is, a workflow can only commence based on documents that are newly stored or have a changed state in a file cabinet. The instance of a workflow is triggered by the notification server, which in turn notifies the workflow server, and the workflow then commences. The workflow designer is where you create and publish your workflows, and that's installed in the new client setup from the web client. The workflow task list is a result list in the web client, and it's based on Silverlight at the moment, and in the future that will be moved to HTML5 technology. Substitution rules for a workflow are required so that as a workflow moves to each user, that user may or may not be available in order to service the requirement. So what we have is an ordered list of users. So you create your substitution lists, and someone's typing. Could you please go on mute? Thank you. So these people appear in the order that you enter them. And what happens is when a person sets their out of office, the workflow engine understands that and will send the document to the next person in the list. So you can see in our manufacturing, if Brian Ford set his out of office, and as you can see he's in 4 workflows, the system understands that, and based on his date and time of being out of office, it would then send the document on to the next person in the list, and so on. The available activities in a workflow are assigned to. Every step in a workflow must be assigned to somebody. So even though there are tasks, parallel tasks, if then else clauses that you can set up, at the end of that particular element, it must be assigned to a user. And you can assign users directly, you can assign users through roles, or obviously substitution rules. Tasks are probably the main component of the workflow. This is where the user will make decisions based on the document and what's required. They can assign values through forms, forms being the same as what you're used to with stamps. You can make direct field assignments to the DocuWare index data, and of course there's the next user assignment in the task. A parallel task is a task that can take place at the same time as another task is happening. So multiple users can make multiple decisions on the same document excuse me, at the same time. And again, they have the same functionality. They can apply data through forms, field assignments, and assign to the next user. The if-else clause allows you to specify where the workflow to make automatic decisions, and we'll clarify that when I actually create the workflow for you. So, how does a workflow instance get created? Well, there's two ways it can happen. First is a new document is stored in the cabinet that meets certain criteria. For example, document type of invoice in with the status of new, and a document that has already been stored in a file cabinet can also be triggered with similar doc type and a change in the status. The notification server detects the change in the status of the document and notifies the workflow engine, which then creates the workflow instance for that document. Okay, so now we're going to show you a simple workflow and trigger that workflow and take you through. So this is our Workflow Designer, which is an installed application on the desktop. And here is an existing workflow. And I'm not even going to go through this particular workflow. It's very long, it's very complex. We're actually going to create a new workflow and show you the main elements. So the first step when you click on New is you need to give it a name. You can give it a description as to what it's doing. You can select your file cabinet and, of course, your trigger conditions. So we're going to trigger this one on New Documents. If the document type equals invoice in, we'll add a new trigger condition, and that will be the status, and the status is new. Simple. Click OK. Now, we immediately get a window up which shows us the graphical elements, and this is just built with drag and drop. So the first thing we must do once our workflow starts is we must assign it to a user. So we simply drag the assign to task onto our desktop, and for the purpose of this demonstration I'm going to assign everything to the same user, because so I'm not taking time toggling backwards and forwards between users. But the user list, see, we can have specific users, roles, or substitution rules. So now my task has been assigned, and now let me just demonstrate this. Down the bottom, the system tries to give you hints if you've forgotten something. This might be a bit small for everybody to see, but down here in red it says Start Activities Exit must be connected. So it's just reminding me that I need to make this connection. Let's do that again. Okay, so now it's connected. The next step is to create a task. So we drag our task onto the form. Try that again. So here's our task, and what we're going to do here, I'm just calling this check invoice amount. And basically what I'm going to have the user do is just check that everything on that invoice, they'll look at the document, check that everything's okay, and by accepting that, they will also set up some global variables that we want to carry through on our workflow. So part of the task, the first thing a user must do is they must make a decision. So to create decisions, you just simply click on the plus, you can remove decisions, etc. So this decision is, I'm just calling this invoice amount. We're going to show the name in the flowchart. Oops, let's just try that again. It's amount. We can put a description in on the decision to be made to tell the user what needs to be done. We can give it a color. Now, rather than clicking next, we're going to just click down here. So the flow is create your decision, set up the common, then do form. Now we need to add a form here under form. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form field. And we're going to call this is just internal, so it's just invoice amount. And you can see it's set up a variable name for the workflow. It's going to hold a numeric value. So we select our correct field type. The default is text 255, so normally that would be adequate. However, now the next thing we want to do is we want to set up our pre-fill. So this is a form field, but we're going to pre-fill it with index data from the document, and we're going to pre-fill it with the amount. So all the user is going to have to do with this particular one is accept the amount. It's going to actually show it to them. So that's our form. I only want that one value. The next thing is assignments. So once we've established that first section, we want to assign data to the document. So our first one is going to be a workflow global variable. And I'm going to click OK here. I'm going to come back to variables because I forgot to create my two variables. This is where you create your system variables. Sorry about that. So the first one is our remaining amount. We'll create another one. And we'll call this one invoice total. This is the total amount of that particular invoice, because we're going to use these values to do comparisons. So now I've got go back now to let's just join these. Okay. Decisions. Now back to our assignments. So now we're going to assign a global variable. The parameter is our global variable we just set, which is remaining amount. It's going to come from our form field. Remember, we created a form field up under form here, and the value is invoice amount. Override existing entries. So that's our first global variable set. Our next variable we're going to set is index data of the document. And what we want to do is we want to commence and show our workflow as starting. So it's index data of the document. We're going to set the status. And it's going to be a fixed entry in progress. So the reason I'm doing that is so that if anybody does a retrieval on that document outside of the workflow, they will be able to see that that document is in progress. Now we want one more assignment, and that will be our invoice total. So again, we select workflow global variable, invoice total. It's going to again come from the form field, and the form field is invoice amount. So when it starts off, our remaining amount and our invoice total will be the same value. And finally, we need to assign to a user. And I'm assigning this to the same user just for expediency. Under escalations, you can set reminder settings if the element of that workflow isn't attended to, the user will get reminded that they need to do it. You can set due dates and set automatic reassignments. For example, if the user doesn't respond and it's 2 days old and they should have responded a couple of days ago, it can automatically reassign to another user, because there is a chance, of course, that that user may not have set their out of office for whatever reason. Okay, so now we have that task. We've also assigned it. Our next step is to do another task, and the most important task in this is we need to assign cost center. So again, we'll call that assign cost center. Again, we put in a task description which can prompt the user as to exactly what they need to do. And of course, we need a decision. So again, we're going to just simply repeat what we had before, which would be assign cost center. Show it in the flowchart. We'll call this also green. Now, we're going to need fields. So the first field we're going to need is a field that allows us to select the cost center. So we'll call this, again, assign cost center. There's our variable name. Text 255 is fine for this. It's going to be mandatory. Now, select list only. We don't want people typing in cost centers, so we're going back to DocuWare here, and we're going to have it bring up the select list of cost centers. Now, once we've assigned the cost center, we also need to assign the amount. And that amount can be the amount of the invoice, or it can be part, particularly if we're allocating to multiple cost centers. So here, call our field cost center amount. And it's going to be a numeric value to 2 decimals. And that's it. That is simply a prompt. Next step, again, assignments. Now, because we've now selected a cost center and we've specified an amount, we need to know how much is remaining on that invoice. We've got to be able to tell the next person in the process, give them some idea of what's left, even if it's the same person. It's just a matter of providing the right feedback to the users. So again, this time it's a workflow variable, and it's remaining amount that we want to adjust, and it's an arithmetic expression. These expressions are simple, and there's a little help here. We have our variables, and we have arithmetic operators. So we scroll down till we find our remaining amount. There it is here. So we select remaining amount, and it fills it in on the form. Our operator is minus. So from the remaining amount, which is the invoice, was the invoice total, we're subtracting the cost center amount that has just been applied. Simple. And that's it for our variable. This now requires to be assigned to. So again, just assign it to our admin user. And for this one, we're done. I'm not doing any escalations or here because it just complicates these workflows. They require a lot of time to think through and quite a lot of testing. So I'm just keeping it simple for the purpose of our demonstration. So we just click OK, and join. Okay, so see now we've got green, which is the color I specified for this particular process. Okay. Now, here's some really cool stuff with the power of this workflow. I'm not doing a parallel task, by the way. If else. What we're doing here is just saying, okay, we may not assign all of the value of that invoice to one particular cost center. So we need to keep assigning cost centers and values until such time as the value of that invoice has been met. So we create an if-else scenario, and we're calling it remaining is less than total. It's just a name. Now we need, again, it's a Visual Basic type expression, but you don't have to know too much about that. You can simply select your variable, and what we're saying is if the remaining amount is less than or equal to 0, and it should never be less than 0, but we're just selecting that, and I'm just going to type in 0. So really what we're saying now is if the remaining amount is less than or equal to 0, then do this. So the then do this, say blue, and we're going to say pay the invoice. Otherwise, which is the else section, go back and assign another cost center. Simple as that. So if that is met, do this. Otherwise, do that. Now, assign cost center. Now, we notice here, notice we have two, I don't know whether you can see it on the demo, but there's two little yellow boxes. Grab one, drag it back to cost center. Now, because it's an if-else, it's asking us for the path. Which part of our if-else statement do we want to execute? Well, we're not executing pay, we're executing assign cost center. There it is. So, if the remaining is less than total, go back to assign cost center. Now we can grab our other little bar. We won't grab that at the moment. The next thing we need to do is another task. Drag that to the form. And this task is simply where we're going to pay the invoice. So, give it a name, pay invoice. Of course, you can give it a description. We need to add a decision. And of course, that's called pay invoice. Some of this looks redundant, type pay invoice, pay invoice. Trust me, keep these decision names clear as you can. Put descriptive text into the decision to be made, because during debugging, you will require that. The more complex your workflow gets, the harder it will be to track down any problems in your flow if you don't keep it neat and orderly. So we're going to pay the invoice. All we need to do here is, after paying the invoice, is change the status. So our little form is called pay invoice. So it's text, and I'm going to pre-fill with with a fixed entry, paid in full. Okay. Assignments. I want to set the index data of the document, the field status, from the form field, pay invoice. Now, even though this is the last step in our process, we still need to assign it. If we don't assign it, we'll get an error. It won't know where to go. So it will not come back to that user. The workflow will know it's ended, but you still need to put that assignment in. Okay. So here we go. There's our pay invoice. Now remember, we've got one bar left on our if-else. See that we've got the two little arrows there. There's two conditions. There's our blue bar, which is pay invoice. And finally, we just need to connect. Sometimes these little bars can get, okay, I've lost my bar. Let me just save that. And see down here it's telling me activity N does not have input. There we go. Sometimes this graphic is can be a little fiddly. Once those bars disappear, they can be hard to get back. Let's just edit it and see if we can. Okay. Remove that activity and put it in again. All right, so there we are. There's our elements. We have a starting point. We're assigning to a user. We'll check the invoice amount. We assign our cost center. If the remaining amount is less than the total, we'll go back and assign another cost center. Otherwise, we'll go to pay the invoice and end our workflow. So to save that, it's telling me I have an error here. Activity pay invoice decision pair must have set. Okay, there we go. I forgot to assign it. No error. We're good. Now I can save the workflow. The next thing to do is to publish the workflow. So to bring workflows in and out of the system, you unpublish and republish. Now I'll publish this and we go to our overview. There's our invoice processing. There it is there. This is the first version. If I make any changes, I will get multiple versions. So you can edit a workflow while documents are in process, because when a document starts into the workflow, it gets the version of that workflow that's currently active. So if you unpublish an active workflow, it doesn't affect the documents in process. It only affects new documents. So our workflow is published. Here, as an administrator, you can click on this and you'll see the active document instances that are in process for that workflow. Okay, so this is ready to go. We can now go and test our workflow in the web client. So here we have an invoice. We're just going to store this invoice through our invoice in. And by the way, these invoices have been indexed with intelligent indexing. So we're setting our company, our voucher number, date, amount, and here's our triggers. It's an invoice in and the status is new. Store that. Now, we just need to wait a few seconds for our notification server to detect that a new document has been stored. Okay, our workflow has commenced. Now, because I'm an administrator, we're getting two buttons here. So I'm running the workflow as a user and as an administrator. The user would only see one of these. You can see here. Now, for the purpose of this demonstration, I've purposely neglected not to show some values here that we ideally want the user to see. This doesn't tell them very much at all. Okay, it's received, there's a reminder, there's a due date. But how much is the invoice? I have to open the invoice to see the value. How much has already been paid? Can't see it. So this is an area that's easily forgotten. So we're going to run this workflow through just to show you what we did. So there's our invoice amount being set. Remember, we pre-filled that with the invoice amount from the document, which is stored in our file cabinet. All we do is confirm. The workflow has now moved to the next user, and it's telling them to assign the cost center. And there's our select list of cost centers, and the user has to fill in the amount. 698.18, and I'm going to pay this in full because I want to go back to our workflow and demonstrate a new instance, because remember, we're testing here. Okay, it's been paid in full, so now it wants to be paid. Simply select paid in full, confirm, workflow's finished. That's done. Now, let's go back and see what we didn't do here. Let's edit our invoice processing. All right. One thing we didn't do was use our global variables. We didn't give the user any feedback as to what was actually happening. So to do that, we go to our workflow tasks, and the workflow tasks are what actually shows in that workflow to the user. So you see we have the activity, the date it was received, the reminder date, and the due date. Well, I'm just going to get rid of those. I want the user to see the customer name. I want them to, without necessarily having to open the document to see, because they might want to cherry pick. This customer has to be paid today, but those others can wait. The user needs as much information as you can provide them without them having to actually go to the document or dig for data. Again, we'll show them the voucher number because the customer may be calling about payment on a particular invoice. Now I want to show them more pertinent information. I want to show them the invoice total, and I want to show them the remaining total. And just for giggles, we'll show them the due date. Now, we can sort by activity. So you can sort by any one of these values I've specified, ascending, descending. I'm just going to take the defaults there. So now I've made a change. I'm going to, actually that change may not have instigated a new instance. Okay, that's good. So that change hasn't forced me to create a new instance. It's merely because I'm changing what's being shown to the user. So that's a good thing. So let's come back and let's test another document in our workflow. Okay, here's another one done by Intelix, and it didn't get the customer, that's why it's red. Everything else is good. Store that. And again, just give notification server a few moments to start that workflow. Okay, there it is. And I still do not have, okay, all right, I still don't have my values that I wanted. Let's just work this one through. I might have to make a different change, so I force a new version to be 493.3.21. Okay, pay it. All right, let's go back now. Let's make another change so that that's good. Let's change the color. That might make a difference. Okay. Task is good. Okay, now I've published it. Let's see if we have a new one. Yes, okay. Now I have my second version of my workflow. So unpublish 1, 2 is published. Okay. Let's drop another document in. And the reason I haven't given Intellex time to invoice this, to due date. Let's see. Okay, store. Okay, now we have something a little bit more meaningful. Here we go. Activity, check the invoice, rapid transport voucher number. Now see, our invoice total and our remaining amount is 0 at the moment. So we've got, now we need to just set those. So here's the invoice amount, double check, yes, that's correct, confirm it. Now we have the values showing the user. So the user's now got a fair amount of information. They don't actually have the document open. So we'll assign the cost center. And we're going to assign $100. Okay, so you see our if-else clause is kicked in, where the next activity is assign cost center, and there's our remaining amount. So the user knows how much is left. Assign that. $300. Okay, $93 left to go. Now, and we'll pay it off. Okay. The invoice is now ready to be paid because invoice amount is now 0. Okay, the invoice is done. Now, I know there's quite a few questions coming up. When we get to the Q&A, I'll run back through those questions and we'll see if we can give you answers. Let's have a look. Okay. There's our invoices that we just processed. It's paid in full. And if we right-click here, we've got an option to show the workflow history. And there's the history of that workflow. Oops. Okay. So, all right. We'll be up to the Q&A shortly where we can, as I said, we'll go through some of these questions and see if we can go back. There is a new database to handle the workflow. The database connection is made as usual in DocuWare administration. It has the following tables: workflows, instances table, actions, users, published settings, permissions, roles, and notifications. The standard DocuWare logging applies, and you can debug log the workflow engine just the same as you do content server, etc. Entries are marked with the workflow instance ID, and sublog entries contain information about the time it takes to execute for a specific action. So if you're looking through there, you can search for time on how much time was needed to execute a particular operation. And that would be how much time it was sitting in a user's list before it was actually acted on. Now, known issues. If notification server is not installed when you install a workflow server, it will be installed. It requires notifications. You also must activate email notification for file cabinets in order for the notification server to even monitor that cabinet for workflow activity. You cannot install a workflow designer. That is the client portion. You can't install it on Windows 8 or Server 2012. So at the moment it's a Windows 7 or Server 2008 only. And there can be issues if you try and run it on a machine where you've got Visual Studio 2012 installed. Okay, this is our Q&A section. I'm just going to have a look now at the questions. Just as a reminder, we'll post all of our webinars at that URL. We'll also post the URL in our support forum. So just give me a moment while I look at some of these questions. Okay, question on, it's assumed that this works on Server 2008 R2, Server 2011 SBS, and Server 2012. Yes, yes. It only with the limitations as far as the workflow designer is concerned. Wherever you can install and run DocuWare, the workflow engine will run. Okay, let's see, what else do we have? Are the workflow task lists the same as, oh, that's been answered. Okay, can the workflow include completely automatic tasks like auto-index job or field reassignment via SQL scripts? No, not at this point. Field values cannot be assigned with a stamp. Stamps are made superfluous with the workflow. There's no reason why you cannot stamp a document if you wish during the workflow, but that they have a counter purpose. The idea of the workflow is so that all the user needs to do is follow the workflow prompts rather than setting stamps, etc. But there is nothing to stop you setting a stamp if you wish. However, the stamp has nothing to do with the workflow and cannot affect the workflow. I'm not sure on this question, where do the assigned amounts show up after the workflow? Well, it depends on as I showed this particular example, I wasn't doing anything with the particular amounts. I'm just showing the workflow through. But everywhere in this process, where I'm assigning cost centers, in the assignments, you assign these values to whatever you want. Notice, I can assign to external data. So, for example, if I'm assigning cost centers and multiple cost centers, I can feed that information back to my ERP system. So it's really where do you want that, that value? It's no different than if today you put a stamp on a document and you specify a cost center. What are you doing with that value? You're either writing it to an index field in DocuWare, or you can feed it back to some sort of external process. Notifications are not received via email. It's purely the workflow job appears in the task list. Question here, is Task Manager list and notification included in the Workflow Manager? In workflows and upgrade. Okay, Pete, you take that one offline, because I think the answer to that basically is no. They're separate, but I'd have to consult the price list, and I don't have that to hand. There's a question on configuring email notification. That's not part of this this presentation, but email notification, you should consult help.docuware.com for all of the DocuWare help. Let's see. Okay, there's a question here on can I show the final field values where I assigned to the multiple cost centers. Well, no, because I didn't, as I just explained, I didn't put them anywhere. I just kept them as part of the workflow. It is up to you to decide where you want those values held and how you're going to handle them. Can you leave visual information on the document containing the value of the variable at that point so you can see who assigned the value? That information should be available in the workflow history. And again, you may need to feed that information back to particular DocuWare index fields. No, there is no export structure of the workflow at the moment. You can only copy a workflow to another one. You can't actually export that out to XML at this point. Question on what about the mobile module? I'm not sure. I will say no at this point, but I'll take that on and we'll check that out for you. Okay, I think I covered that. All right, a couple of points of view from me. This is not easy, okay? You've got to work with this product. You have to start with something very simple. Set up a simple 1 or 2 step workflow and test it. You need to get a feeling for, just how it all hangs together. And because the more complex you make it, the harder you're going to find it. But once you get a feeling for the flow, you generally will be okay with it. Couple of things that I really need to mention. There is no hotline support for your workflow configuration. If you are having trouble configuring your workflow, the hotline or support cannot help you with it. This is going to get so complicated that we can't have support technicians trying to figure out what you may have done wrong with your workflow. If you require workflows to be built, that will fall under professional services. So you need to go, consult help.docuware.com. The workflow, all of DocuWare 6 help is out there now, but you need to work with it, debug it. Use the debugging tools, and I didn't show you that, but I can. Once you've set up a workflow, you can actually send it through a debugger. It doesn't tell you much except whether your workflow actually gets to the end or not. So you can actually run it through theoretically here. Personally, I think you get a better idea if you actually set it up, assign it to a test cabinet and run it through test and do it step by step. Test a section, make sure that works, then add to it, then change it. This, just for an idea, this workflow here took me probably 4 hours from the concept to having it executable. And it seems very simple, but there's so many little things that you can forget and not do. So practice. And as I say, once you get into it, you'll be fine. But from a technical perspective and ADPs, there's a lot of professional service dollars to be made with this, because it can be a lot of time. But design your workflow on paper. Get the concept first, then start putting it together in the designer. Okay, there's just a couple more questions have come up. Luis, AutoIndex uses workflow data to exchange. Well, no, AutoIndex is not used in this process at all. If you want to run AutoIndex, again, it's a separate module you do with AutoIndex or extract data as you wish. The workflow is based on, let's see, based on Silverlight. What is the problem with Windows 8? Fabio, that's a question I can't answer. This is information that has come back from R&D, and I don't have an answer for that. But one can only assume that there are some sort of issues as far as the Windows 8 architecture. I am sure that will be overcome. I mean, this is just the first release of the product, and these are the shortcomings that have been that we've, they've obviously found in the new release of it. Okay, that is it for our presentation. It will be posted in a couple of hours at the URL on our screen, DocuWareCorp.com, DWC Files webinar. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Appreciate it.